In this lesson, we'll talk about maintaining state in web applications and what ASP.NET 2.0 does for you to manage the state across multiple requests by a single user. But first, we'll talk a little bit more about the page object, as well as several of the important objects that are programmatically available to your applications. In the previous lesson, we talked about the page object, and I said that it was an object that encapsulated a single request and response from a single user for a single page. And that's actually a little bit of a misnomer. It should work as a working definition for right now. But the page gave us access to important information like whether or not the current page request was the original request or whether it was the result of a postback. And then we were able to write code based on that. The static page object contains several other static objects that allow us to programmatically work with all aspects of a user's interaction with our web application. So let's start looking at each of these objects and see what they do and how we can use them within our apps. And we'll be using most of these objects throughout the remainder of these lessons, so consider this just a quick overview of the general features and not a comprehensive explanation of each and every one. So first of all, we'll start off with the request and the response objects. The request really encapsulates all the information about a request from a user's web browser. So whenever they type in http://www.whatever.com/yourpage.aspx, all of that request plus information about the user's browser plus any data that might be transferred along with the request in the HTTP GET or the POST, for example, like form data or query string data, that's all contained and accessible to us in the request object. Now, once our application has an opportunity to manipulate the results and we're going to send information back out to the user, we would use a response object. If you recall from the previous video, we did page.response.write, which allowed us to send just a quick string of information to the web page. So this response object allows us, it encapsulates all the information about what our application will be sending in response to the user's request. Okay, then we also saw the application and session objects in the previous videos, and you recall that the session object encapsulates all the information for a single user's interaction at one period in time with our website, whereas the application object has attributes and methods of the application as a whole. And we were able to use these objects in order to store some stateful information that was saved between requests. And we're going to talk about these more in this lesson as well. Then you have the form object, which is actually very similar to the request object, except it just gives us a subset of the same information. So we're able to get any information that was passed along in the HTTP post for the given request. So we're able to grab off any fields of data that were sent over in just a typical HTTP post. And then there's a trace object that's available, and as we're going to see in the next lesson, this object encapsulates information that we're going to use in order to debug and monitor our application's performance. And then we have an object called the user, and this allows us to provide some security to our application. So each user can have roles that they're associated with, and based on those roles they can have access or be denied access to certain resources on our website. And then there's a server object, and that has information about the web server in general and keeps information about like the path, the file path of our specific application as it runs in the server and things of that nature. And then there's an object that's kind of neat called the previous page object, and this gives us information about the previous page that was served to the user before the current page that our request is currently handling, or that our code is currently handling. And also, I said that each of these objects are accessible through their parent object, the page object, but that's actually a little bit of a misnomer as well, because each of these are accessible without having to type in like page.request or page.response or page.trace. You can just type in request. some property or method or response dot, because there's a implied import statement that's used by our web applications. Okay, so I just wanted you to be aware of these high-level objects because we kind of used them but have glossed over them up to this point. And all of these objects really encapsulate a great deal of functionality that we can draw on as we develop our applications. But let's continue on and now talk about application state. When you used C# in the past to create Windows Forms applications, you didn't have to worry a lot about the state of the application because the applications you built started up, ran for a few minutes or for a few hours, and then when the user shut it down, the program was cleared out of the computer's memory. Now, during the time that the program was running, you may have had a handful of variables that stored important application information like user information and what windows have been opened or what information is loaded into the current application. And those variables were kept alive the entire time that the program was alive, and they were programmatically available for you to retrieve and to change in code. Also, you may have had one or more forms that were visible at all times while the application was running. So there was really this concept, this state that the application was just around and it was alive for long periods of time. You didn't have to worry about retrieving the information every time somebody wanted to make an interaction with your application, because the program was persistently in the memory of the computer until you shut the program down. But that's in sharp contrast to the way that you create web applications. Each web page is in a website has no inherent knowledge of any other web page in that same website. You can almost think of each individual web page as an application in and of itself that's only fired off when that page is requested. So each web page that you request from an ASP.NET based website is like a mini application unto itself. It runs for less than a second, like a fraction of a second, and based on the request, or in other words, the information that's coming in, it constructs a response, and that information is then sent back to the web browser. So if each page of a web application is only live for less than a fraction of a second, how do you transfer the important data between web pages? How do you retain variable information like a setting that they used on page 1, some option that they typed in? How do you save it into page 3 or page 4 within your web application? Or in the case where we're performing a postback, how do the controls know to retain their values from post to post? So in the past, had you not used ASP.NET to develop your applications, these were all things that you would have had to worry about. But once again, ASP.NET does the dirty work, the heavy lifting for you, so you don't even need to think about it most of the time. Now, however, there might be some instances where you need a little bit more control, or at least some more options, about how to manage the state of your application. So I want to show you a few ways that this is enabled in ASP.NET 2.0. So what we'll do is start off by creating a new website. Make sure that our ASP.NET website template is selected and that our language is Visual C#. And then we're going to call this Lesson 04. And then we'll click the OK button. After a moment or so, we'll get our default.aspx page. And here what I want to do is drag and drop 2 text boxes onto the designer surface. I'll arrange them in just a moment. Drag a label and a button. And then I'm going to arrange them like so on my form. And then I want to change the names at the very least of each of the controls because I'm going to be referencing them in code. So, for example, here I want to call this first text box. I'm going to call this one second text box. Okay, I want to then select the button, and I'm going to call this OK button, and I'll even change the property, text property of this, as I will the text property of the label, and I'll call this result label. Great. Okay, so now we've set up our example and we're ready to go. What I want to do is write some code behind the OK button, and the first thing that we're going to do is demonstrate how to use, or how viewState works, and then we'll show how to use viewState within our own applications for some custom values that we'll put in. So we have done something like this a couple of times already, so this shouldn't be anything really that new. I'm just going to populate the result label.text with the first text box.text property. I'm going to concatenate in an empty space and then second text box.text, and then we're going to save our application and then run it, and the result should be familiar to you. We've seen this already in how this works, where after the post back it'll then recompile the page, exchanging the value of the label with its new value that we set within our event handler. Okay, now that explains how the label works, but how do the text boxes retain the values Bob and Tabor? We didn't write the code to do that. Well, ASP.NET 2.0, again, takes care of this for us. And again, it gives us this illusion of a highly interactive page without having to write a lot of code in order to accomplish this. So as we would expect within a Windows Form application, whenever you click the OK button and enact on the data that's been entered into a form, you wouldn't expect the form to then be completely empty all over again unless you programmatically chose to do that. So we want the same functionality from our web pages in some case, and that's, as you can see, is enabled automatically by ASP.NET 2.0. But how does it work behind the scenes? Well, let's do this. Let's right-click within this empty area here on our web page and select the View Source. And when we do, we're going to see that within the body of our HTML code, there is this input, type equals hidden, name equals underscore underscore view state. Okay, and then look at the value of the view state. There's some crazy numbers and letters. This big long string, and it goes way off the side of our web page here. And what this is an encoded string that represents both the controls and the values that should be supplied to the controls on a postback by postback basis. So if we were to click the OK button one more time within our web form, this data that's stored in the value property of our view state hidden form field would get posted back to the ASP.NET runtime, which would get then passed to some special handler code that's written in ASP.NET 2.0 that helps us retain the state of those text boxes and any other controls that might be represented on our web form. This is one way that ASP.NET 2.0 can tell if something has changed from the previous version of the page and the new version of the page, so that you get some rich functionality like handling an event for the text change property or the selected index change property of a drop-down combo box. And if you have a lot of form fields, this string can even get very, very large, so you want to be cognizant of that. However, what you can do is leverage the same technology in order to store your own values that you need to keep around from post to post for a given web form. So, for example, what we can do is something that looks like this. We'll type in if page.isPostback equals false. Then what we'll do is go view state, and so we're going to add an item to the view state and let ASP.NET 2.0 worry about encoding it in those special funky characters. We don't care about that. We just need to use regular old English in order to, first of all, create a key and then set that key to a value. So our key is going to be something like view state item. We can call this whatever we want, any variable name that we want to just keep around. And then we'll pass in a value. In this case, I'll just do something simple like hello world. Okay, so we are going to store the value hello world in the page. And then after the user clicks the OK button, we're going to retrieve that value out from the view state, from that long list of numbers and characters that were stored in that hidden form field, and then refresh our label with that value. So here I'm going to comment that out and replace it with something like this. Result label.text equals view state. Okay. Then we're going to access a property that's stored within the view state by using the little open bracket, view state item. Now, since this is returned to us in the form of an object, we're going to need to convert that to a string so that it can be properly represented by C#. So let's see what we got here. Let's run our application. Okay, now at this point, the word hello world is somewhere encoded in this big long list of view state stuff. Now we can't read it, but it's in there somewhere, okay? So that when we hit the OK button, it's retrieved back out and then programmatically placed on our web page. Pretty neat, huh? So that's one way that we can maintain state. Now again, we need to be aware to not try to store too much stuff in there. But we can store any type of primitive variables like ints or doubles or strings or whatever the case might be. We can also store complex objects, custom objects that we create. So we can create a car class, populate all the properties of the car class, and then store that within the view state and then retrieve it back out. Again, it's going to make the web page a little bit longer perhaps, so you want to be very cognizant that you're not making your pages too big by that. But it's pretty cool nonetheless. Now the next thing that we do is what we did in the previous video, where we basically added a global.asax page to our website and stored things, at least in the last video, we stored things in the application object, right? Well, I want to demo the ability to create values that are stored within the session object. We do it the exact same way. So, for example, right here, what we can do is go session.add, and then we can type in some value, and in this case we could put any value that we wanted to in here. Now just for fun, I think we talked about this briefly in the last lesson. If not, I just want to bring to a reminder, how does the session work? For example, how does ASP.NET 2.0 know that this particular session object in memory belongs to the current person who is requesting through their web browser, requesting this web page? And the way that it does it is, as soon as your user comes and visits your web page, a session ID is assigned to that person, and that session ID is stored within the user's cookie. So a little bit of HTTP header information is passed back in the response, and then from there the value is stored in the cookie on the user's hard drive. Okay, so we can do something like this and retrieve back out the session ID that's been assigned to that person by doing that. Okay, so we are just simply taking the session ID and storing it into a variable that we're going to store within the session's collection of items called some value, and then back over here in our default.aspx, what we'll do is retrieve that out when somebody clicks the OK button. So result label.text equals, and here we'll go session, whoops, accidentally hit the wrong key there, session some value, and then we'll do a toString on it just to be sure that we get it out. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and run it, our application. This time we'll click the OK button, and notice that we get this crazy string of numbers and letters. Again, that is the unique ID that's assigned to me, to my current session for the current website. Now if I were to shut my browser down and come back a little bit later, once the session died out, then I would be assigned a new session ID and so forth. But that's how we can save state within the session object, doing it the same way that we did in the previous video, by just invoking an add like we've done here in the global.asax, creating some value. We can call this whatever we want, this key, and then pass in a value. Now it's stored in the session for that user. It's stored in the computer's memory, and it'll be flushed out whenever the session ends. Okay, now the challenge with both of these methods of storing data is that there's really two problems. The first problem is that they're not strongly typed. So in other words, whenever we're using the session object, we could misspell some value over here on a web page, and we would never be able to figure out where our value went until we realize, oh, I named it differently, and that's why it's not pulling the correct data out of the session object. So wouldn't it be nice to have the C# compiler tell us if this was not spelled correctly? The second weakness is that in both the cases, view state and session, where the data is ultimately stored is problematic. In the case of view state, the data is stored back into the web page. So if you're trying to store lots of information into the view state, then your web pages become really, really big, and it slows down the transmission of those web pages across the internet. In the case of session, you're holding on to all these values that you're potentially storing within the session object within the computer's memory. Or if you have lots of users that are currently accessing your website, there's a lot of memory consumption that occurs in a very short period of time, which can affect the performance of your website. Now, that has been improved somewhat from previous versions of ASP.NET in the latest release, ASP.NET 2.0. However, it's always something that we should be cognizant of as software developers. But what if we could solve both of these problems? Have a strongly typed set of values that we can customize and rely on the names of those items to be checked at compile time, and have the benefit of storing the data in a more logical place, like, for example, a data store, a database, an XML file, or whatever the case might be. Well, we can do that through the use of the profile object, which is new to ASP.NET 2.0. Now, the way that you use the profile object is through the web.config file. So let's go ahead and open up the web.config file. Now, up to this point, we haven't really talked about logging in and enabling security and roles and things of that nature. So what I'm going to have to do is enable profiles for anonymous users. So I'm going to copy and paste some code that I wrote a little bit earlier that'll demonstrate how to define some properties that are used by anonymous users through the profile object. Hopefully this will all become clearer once I complete the example. So I'm going to paste in some code into my web.config file, making sure that I do it right before the end system.web tag. So you can see the first tag that I have here, the first element is anonymous identification enabled equal true. And then we have a profile element enabled equal true, and a list of properties to which we add a property called myNewProperty, and I set the allow anonymous equal to true. We can also set the data type here, but by default the data type will be a string, which will work just fine for our purposes. Now let's do this. Let's go back to our default.aspx.cs file, and let's comment out this line of code and exchange that with result label dot text equal profile dot my new property. See how that came up in IntelliSense? It's strongly typed. The profile object knows about the existence of the new property that I created and allows me to access that, and via not only IntelliSense, but also it knows if I were to try to type this incorrectly, it would tell me there is no such property as my news property, for example. So let's do this, and since it's already typed as a string, we don't need to do any conversion of toString to it. What I'll do here in the page load is I'll get rid of this view state, and instead I'm going to put in profile.myNewProperty equals the color red. I don't know. Okay, just some string, whatever the case might be. Put anything in there that we want to. I'm going to run the application now. I click the OK button, and it grabs red from the storage area. Now, where is it actually stored? That really depends. we can set it up to be stored within a SQL Server database, even a SQL Server 2005 Express Edition database, an XML file, an Access database, or we can create a custom way to store this information. But the neat thing is that we didn't have to write any property gets or sets. All we had to do was define what properties we wanted to enable within our web.config file, and then ASP.NET 2.0 takes care of the rest for us through the use of the profile object. And we don't have to just use simple types either. We can use collections or objects that we define, whatever the case might be. So it's very powerful and very cool and new to ASP.NET 2.0. Okay, let's take a look at the various ways that we've talked about so far for storing state. We talked about view state, and we said that view state is perfect for storing state for a single page that's requested and re-requested by a single user. If we need to store state across multiple pages for a single user, then there's a couple of ways to accomplish this. We already talked about the session object. And recall that the session object encapsulates a series of requests from a single user. The way that ASP.NET keeps track of each user is through the use of a temporary cookie where it stores a unique ID called the session ID that's assigned to each new subsequent session as it begins. And then with each subsequent request by the end user's web browser, the cookie is sent through the HTTP header back to ASP.NET, and it knows to retrieve the values from memory for that specific user. We can even access that session ID programmatically as we demonstrated here just a moment ago. So the difference between view state and session is that view state only works for a single page, session works across multiple pages for a single user. Now both of these methods are flawed in so much that, first of all, they are not strongly typed, and then secondly is the method in which the values are stored. We talked about that a little bit, and then we introduced the concept of profile and how to create a strongly typed set of properties within a web.config that doesn't require that we write any property get or property set code, and has the added advantage of being able to define where we want to store the information, whether it's in the computer's memory, the server's memory, or in a database, an XML file, or whatever the case might be. And we didn't demonstrate that because it's a little bit more advanced, but this would be the preferred way to store information. Now, what if you need to maintain state some sort of global setting across all users and all pages of your website? Well, we saw that in the previous lesson, right? We used the application object and we created a poor man's visitor counter. So I'll refer you back to the previous lesson. Now let's move on and talk about how to maintain state in a more traditional way, where we are passing values from one page to the next page without the use of any of these special mechanisms that have been provided for us. In other words, why don't we just use some of the built-in mechanisms to the HTTP and HTML specifications? So using query strings, for example, and posting of data from one page to another page, like you may have used in previous versions of ASP or in some of the other technologies that are available to develop dynamic websites. Well, ASP.NET 2.0 supports these as well. So let me show you how some of this is accomplished. Let's go back to our default .aspx page. I'm going to drag over a new control called the hyperlink control. And the cool thing about the hyperlink control is that we can programmatically set the navigation URL and the target in our C# code. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and just use the properties window, but this is fully accessible behind like the button click event or the page load, for example. If we wanted to data bind this to a database, it would work as well. But in our case right now, what I want to do is send whenever somebody clicks this link, send them over to a new page that I'm going to create in just a moment, page2.aspx, and I can also pass in what's called a query string. Now, if you're not familiar with the query string, it's extra information that's passed along in the get of the HTTP request. So the get is in the actual URL itself, and we can put anything like my value equal Bob, and that name value pair, here's the name, my value, and then the value is Bob. We can pass that along, and then it can be retrieved programmatically from the target page, in this case page2.aspx. So let's add a new item, new web form called page2. to our website and click the Add button. And here in our page load, we're going to do something like this. Well, let me do this as well. Let's go ahead and put a label on our form. And we'll change this to result label. So then in our page load, we'll do result label.text equals request. So we're going to use the request object that we talked about in the beginning of this video and request one individual key that has been passed along. In this case, we're going to do my value, right? Because that's passed along in the query string. And then we'll just toString it. Whoops. Just to be on the safe side. And so let's set default as the start page and then hit the run button. And now as you can see, I'll hover my mouse cursor over and notice at the very bottom that we have the link localhost :2128 lesson 4 page2.aspx my value equals Bob. So we're going to pass my value equal Bob over to page2.aspx. Page2.aspx in the page load event looks at the query string, grabs it off, and then places the value programmatically into a label and displays the value in the label. Okay? Very cool. Let's do this. Let's add some more controls to page 2 so we can demonstrate something else that we can do, and that is a cross-page postback, which is also new to ASP.NET 2.0. So I'm going to take my text box and my button, and I'm going to call this something special. And I've got to remember what I call it because I need to access it programmatically in the next page. Okay, up to this point, our postbacks have always just taken us back to the same spot. Right? We have just gone right back to the same page. But what if we need to post to another page? What we can do in our button, which will actually submit the form, is set this postback URL. And so we'll set this to page3.aspx, a new page I'm going to add to my website. So as long as we set the postback URL, this will be the page that it posts to rather than simply posting back to page2.aspx. So we'll click Add New Item, Web Form. We'll change this to page3.aspx. Click the Add button. And now here we'll add another label control. Call this Result Label. All right. And then, whoops, label. And then in the page load, what we'll do is this. Result label.text equals request. And again, we're just going to access an item of the form, so we can just open up a square bracket, type in the key. What will the key be? It'll be the name of that text box we just added onto page2.aspx. So it'll be postback text box, I believe, right? And then we'll do a toString. Whoops, again to be on the safe side. Great. Let's see if this works now. So we'll go from default to get to page 2, and on page 2 we'll type in some such, click the button, and it posts it, notice, to page3.aspx. We grab the value that was in our text box, and we retrieve that and display it here in a label. Okay, so in this lesson we talked about the page object and some of the objects that belong to the page that encapsulate the various aspects of a user's experience on our website. And with those objects, we can programmatically manage the state of our web applications. We talked about state and demonstrated various ways of maintaining state on the server, including the view state, the session, the profile object. We also looked at other ways of passing data between web requests, such as query strings and cross-page postbacks. And there's actually several other ways to maintain state that we didn't talk about, like managing cookies, for example. And ASP.NET 2.0 provides a simple programming interface to manage that as well. But all this should suffice for right now and get you headed in the right direction. So if you enjoyed this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and more. Thank you.